Welcome to Moonnest, where stories drift like stars across the sky. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we'll wander into a gentle tale spun just for sleep. Let your mind slow, your breath soften, and stay with us. The next story is even more magical. In the heart of Starfall village, where cobblestones glimmered under the moon's watchful gaze, there lived a lantern keeper named Eloan. Her cottage, dusted with ivy and tucked between narrow, winding streets, stood at the edge of the village square. Every evening, as dusk spilled its colors across the sky, Eloan would step out with her lantern staff, a slender rod of ashwood, tipped with a shard of moonstone that caught the light like a whisper of dawn. One by one, she would light the village lanterns, her footsteps soft on the stones, her breath visible in the cool evening air. The lamps of Starfall were not ordinary lights. They burned with hues of twilight and dawn, casting gentle glows that seemed to hum with quiet secrets. Some shimmered with the pale blush of morning, others with the cool gleam of midnight frost. It was said that these lights were enchanted, that they remembered whispers spoken beneath them and wishes cast into their glow. Eloan, with her careful hands and patient heart, tended to them each evening, whispering small blessings as each one flickered to life. But there was one lantern, tall and wrought with iron vines, that stood at the center of the square. Its glass was clouded with the breath of time, and its frame twisted with age. Townsfolk hurried past it without a glance, speaking only in hushed whispers of the lantern of sable flame. Some said it once burned with light so bright it turned night into dawn, others claimed it was merely a tale for children. Its iron vines curled around its frame like frozen tendrils of ivy, and at its base, cobblestones were etched with symbols long forgotten. Eloan, who carried light like it was woven into her very soul, couldn't help but wonder each time she passed it. On winter evenings, when the stars hummed low and frost kissed the cobbles, she would pause beside it, her lantern staff casting long shadows against its iron frame. Sometimes, just for a heartbeat, she thought she saw a flicker, like the ghost of a flame. But when she blinked, it was gone. One evening, as frost crept along the windowsills and the air grew heavy with the scent of cedar smoke, Eloan found herself lingering by the lantern once more. The square was silent, shadows stretching long under the pale moonlight. Her hand, slender and steady, reached out to brush the iron vines, fingertips grazing the cold, rough metal. To her surprise, it was warm, not the chill she expected from years of disuse. Startled, she pulled her hand back, breath fogging in the crisp air. Her lantern staff flickered gently at her side, casting a soft glow that danced along the iron. In the days that followed, Eloan returned often, her curiosity growing with each visit. Something about the warmth she had felt lingered in her thoughts, like the memory of a distant melody. Each night, as she lit the lanterns and watched their light spill across cobbled paths and ivy-clad walls, her gaze would drift back to the lantern of sable flame. It was as if it whispered to her, softly, silently, a murmur that tugged at the edges of her dreams. It was on the seventh evening, when the moon hung heavy and full above the rooftops, that Eloan approached with purpose. Her lantern staff flickered as she stepped forward, the air growing still around her. She reached out once more, pressing her hand firmly against the iron vines. This time, the warmth pulsed, softly, steadily, like the heartbeat of something long asleep. Eloan did not pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her breath fogging the glass as she whispered, "Are you waiting for something?" The words hung in the stillness, suspended between frost and flame. For a moment, she swore she saw a flicker, just the faintest glimmer, at the core of the lantern. But then it faded, leaving only darkness. Eloan stepped back, her heart fluttering like a sparrow's wings, the night stretching silent and still around her. But now she knew, something was waiting, and she intended to find out what it was. The days stretched long and soft as winter deepened its hold on Starfall village. Frost rimed the windows of Eloan's cottage, painting delicate patterns that caught the morning light. But her thoughts remained tangled with the lantern of sable flame. By day, she would tend to her chores, sweeping the cobblestones before her door, polishing the glass of her own lanterns, but always with a distant look in her eyes. By night, she would pass the iron lantern, hand brushing its vines, feeling the warmth that pulsed beneath her fingertips, gentle, steady, like a sleeping heart. One evening, when the moon hung low and heavy, she lingered longer than usual, her breath rising in soft plumes. She circled the lantern slowly, studying the ironwork etched with curling symbols. They were unfamiliar to her, their shapes winding like the roots of old trees. She knelt down, brushing away a dusting of snow to reveal more markings along the base. Her fingertips traced the patterns, the cold biting her skin, but she did not pull away. The wind stirred around her, whispering through the eaves of distant roofs, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and snow. Eloan leaned closer, pressing her ear gently against the iron frame. For a moment, she thought she heard it, a whisper, soft as a sigh, threading its way through the silence. Her heart quickened, and she pulled back, staring up at the darkened glass. It remained still, reflecting only the shimmer of stars above. That night, Eloan lay awake long after the village lights had dimmed. The flickers she had seen, the whispers she had heard, were they merely tricks of light and shadow? But she knew the warmth beneath her hand had been real. Something pulsed within that iron shell, waiting. Her eyes grew heavy as she lay curled beneath her blankets, but her thoughts drifted back to the lantern, its iron vines wrapping around her dreams like tendrils of ivy. She promised herself that the next evening, she would return, not just to wonder, but to understand. The following evening arrived swathed in mist, curling through the cobbled streets like drifting ghosts. Eloan stepped out of her cottage, lantern staff in hand, and began her rounds as always. She moved from lamp to lamp, the moonstone tip flaring with soft light as she touched each wick, bringing warmth to the shadows. But tonight, her hands moved more quickly, her steps more purposeful. She finished her path just as the last hues of twilight faded, and with a deep breath, she made her way to the center of the square. The lantern stood as it always had, silent, untouched, wrapped in iron vines that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Eloan approached with care, her fingers brushing the rough metal. Warmth spread beneath her touch, and she pressed her palm flat against it, feeling the gentle thrum that pulsed there. Her breath clouded the glass as she leaned in close, her voice a whisper. "What are you hiding?" she asked, the words barely louder than a breath. At first, there was nothing, only the stillness of winter air and the distant creak of branches swaying in the wind. But then, just as she was about to step back, she saw it, a flicker, faint but unmistakable, deep within the glass. It shimmered for only a heartbeat before fading back into darkness. Eloan gasped, her fingers curling around the iron frame. "You're still alive," she murmured, the words slipping from her lips before she could catch them. The wind stirred around her, swirling leaves at her feet, whispering through the eaves of distant rooftops. Eloan remained still, her hand resting against the lantern, her heart thrumming with the thrill of discovery. Whatever magic lay trapped within its iron shell, it was waiting for light, for breath, for something she did not yet understand. But she knew now that it was real, and she was determined to uncover its secret. The days grew shorter, and the snow fell in whispering layers across the cobblestones of Starfall village. Eloan continued her nightly rounds, lighting the lanterns with careful hands, her thoughts always drifting back to the lantern of sable flame. Her fingers would brush its iron vines each evening, feeling the steady warmth that pulsed beneath her touch. But now, she watched with sharper eyes, studying the flickers that danced at its heart, tiny sparks that came and went like the breath of a sleeping creature. One evening, as the first stars pricked through the twilight haze, Eloan brought with her a small pouch of salt and a sprig of dried lavender. They were charms, old and whispered of by elders in hushed tones. She sprinkled the salt in a careful circle around the base of the lantern, her breath coming out in soft clouds of mist. The lavender she held to her lips, whispering a blessing before tying it gently to one of the iron vines. For a moment, the air grew still, the wind pausing as if in thought. Eloan stepped back, heart fluttering with a whisper of hope. Nothing happened. The lantern remained silent, its glass reflecting only the glimmer of nearby lights. Eloan's shoulders sagged, and she brushed the frost from her hands, watching as it drifted to the cobblestones. But as she turned to go, a faint glow, soft and flickering, caught the edge of her vision. She whirled back, eyes wide. There it was, light, delicate as a firefly's wing, shimmering in the center of the glass. It danced for a heartbeat before fading back into shadow. Her pulse quickened, and she stepped forward, pressing her hands to the iron frame. Warmth flooded her fingertips, spreading up her palms and through her arms. "You are waking," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. The lantern did not answer, but the warmth remained, thrumming steadily beneath her touch. Eloan stepped back, her heart a fluttering thing in her chest. Whatever she had done, whatever charm she had cast, it had worked. The lantern was stirring. And she intended to keep it that way. The next night arrived cloaked in mist and silence, the village lamps flickering like stars caught in glass. Eloan made her rounds swiftly, her hands nimble and sure, her thoughts clouded with anticipation. She had brought with her a small iron key, found tucked away in an old chest she kept beneath her bed. Its origin was unknown, she had discovered it years ago, tangled in the lining of her mother's old cloak. It was small and heavy, with markings that spiraled across its surface like tendrils of ivy. When she reached the lantern of sable flame, the village square was empty and still. Her breath puffed white in the chill air as she knelt before the iron frame. Her fingertips brushed the vines, searching for a lock, anything that might match the key. At first, there was nothing, just the cold bite of iron beneath her hands. But as her fingers trailed along its base, she felt it, a small indentation, hidden beneath layers of frost and dust. Eloan brushed it clean, revealing a keyhole wrought into the metal, so finely carved it nearly disappeared into the ironwork. Her heart quickened, and she slid the key from her pocket, its weight solid and reassuring in her palm. She glanced around. The square remained empty, the village lights flickering softly in the mist. With a deep breath, she pressed the key into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, with the softest of clicks, the mechanism turned, and the iron vines shuddered beneath her touch. She pulled her hand back, heart leaping to her throat. The lantern remained still, its glass dark and silent, but something had changed. She could feel it, like the breath before a whisper. Eloan stepped back, clutching the key in her hand, eyes fixed on the lantern. It had been locked for as long as anyone could remember. But now, with that single turn, she had opened a door, perhaps not one seen with the eyes, but one that had waited for generations to be unlatched. And whatever lay behind it was waking. The snow thickened as the days wore on, layering the rooftops of Starfall village with quiet softness. Eloan's footsteps left gentle impressions in the fresh powder as she moved through the square, her lantern staff casting a warm glow ahead of her. Since the night she had turned the iron key, the lantern of sable flame seemed different. Its iron vines glimmered faintly beneath the frost, as if kissed by some unseen light. Eloan approached it with cautious reverence, her hands slipping from her mittens as she brushed her fingertips along its surface. The warmth was stronger now, pulsing softly beneath her touch. She leaned in, her breath fogging the glass as she pressed her ear to its side. For a moment, there was only silence, the soft hush of snow falling and the distant murmur of wind. But then she heard it, a whisper, soft and distant, like the rustling of leaves at twilight. It was not words exactly, but something older, like the sigh of trees or the breath of stars. Her eyes widened, and she stepped back, the frost crackling under her boots. The lantern's glass flickered, just for a heartbeat, casting long shadows that danced across the cobbles. Eloan's heart fluttered in her chest, and she circled the iron frame, studying its surface. The markings she had traced with her fingertips before seemed clearer now, as if the frost had melted away to reveal patterns of ivy and crescent moons. Symbols she did not understand wound around its base, looping and swirling like frozen rivers. That night, as she lay curled beneath her blankets, sleep did not come easily. Her thoughts were tangled with whispers and flickering lights, iron vines, and long-forgotten symbols. She rose before dawn, the sky still heavy with stars, and made her way back to the square. The lantern stood waiting, its surface glimmering softly in the first light of morning. Eloan placed her hand against it, and for the first time, she felt it thrum, not with warmth alone, but with life. Winter settled its cloak over Starfall, draping the village in a hush of frost and stillness. Eloan's footsteps crunched softly as she made her nightly rounds, her lantern staff trailing light behind her like a ribbon of stars. But each evening now, she ended her path at the center of the square, where the lantern of sable flame stood like a sentinel of iron and shadow. Its frame, once still and untouched, now seemed to hum with quiet energy. The markings glowed faintly beneath the frost, curling vines and ancient symbols whispering secrets she could not understand. One evening, as snow drifted gently from a pale sky, Eloan came prepared. In her hands, she carried a small mirror, a relic from her mother's things, its surface polished and framed in tarnished silver. She approached the lantern with care, holding the mirror up to its glass. At first, there was nothing, only the reflection of her own eyes, wide and curious. But as she angled the mirror just right, she saw it, the flicker of light she had glimpsed before, shimmering at the lantern's heart. It pulsed softly, like the beat of distant wings. Her breath caught, and she stepped back, eyes fixed on the glow. It was real, she had seen it. Eloan turned the mirror in her hands, watching the light bend and shimmer, casting delicate patterns across the snow. She reached out, pressing her hand to the iron vines, and the warmth spread through her fingertips, deeper than before. A whisper, soft and almost melodic, threaded through the silence. Eloan closed her eyes, her heartbeat steady, her breath fogging the air. "You're waking," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the falling snow. The light flickered once more, steady and sure, before fading back into shadow. Eloan stood there for a long time, hand pressed against the iron frame, feeling the warmth hum beneath her touch. Whatever slumbered within the lantern was stirring, and she would be there to welcome it when it finally awoke. The snow continued to fall, blanketing Starfall village in a shimmering hush. Eloan's routine never wavered. Each evening, she lit the lamps that lined the cobbled paths, her lantern staff flickering with soft light as she moved from post to post. But her heart was always drawn to the square, where the lantern of sable flame stood like a sentinel from another time. It had become part of her ritual. She would approach with careful steps, her hands brushing its iron vines, feeling the familiar warmth pulsing beneath her fingertips. Tonight, however, something was different. The moment she stepped into the square, she felt it, a change in the air, a soft whisper of something just beyond reach. The lantern shimmered faintly, its glass catching the moonlight in fractured prisms. Eloan approached slowly, her breath rising in soft plumes. Her hand reached out, fingers grazing the iron surface, and she paused. The symbols, once faint and hidden beneath frost, now glowed faintly, an ethereal light tracing their lines like threads of silver. Her heart quickened, and she pressed her hand firmly to the glass. Warmth bloomed beneath her touch, stronger than before, thrumming steadily against her palm. A whisper curled through the silence, not words exactly, but a sense, a feeling of something shifting, stretching awake. Eloan leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. "Are you trying to speak?" she whispered, her voice soft and uncertain. The light flickered, shimmering just beneath the surface. Eloan's eyes widened, and she glanced around. No one wandered the square at this hour. She was alone. Carefully, she traced the symbols with her fingertips, the glow brightening where she touched. A whisper of wind stirred her cloak, rustling the ivy that crept along the iron frame. Her heartbeat drummed in her ears, steady and sure. The lantern pulsed once beneath her hand, then fell still. Eloan stepped back, her breath coming in soft clouds. Whatever lay within the iron frame was waking, and it was reaching out. The days grew longer as winter began its slow surrender to spring. Frost still rimed the rooftops in the early mornings, but the air held a hint of warmth, a whisper of things to come. Eloan continued her evening rounds, her lantern staff glowing with soft light as she moved through the cobbled paths. But the lantern of sable flame remained her final stop, her fingertips grazing its iron vines each night, feeling the warmth that pulsed beneath its surface. One evening, she came prepared. Draped over her arm was a length of pale linen, stitched with threads of silver. It was an heirloom from her grandmother, a woman who had whispered stories of magic and light before the fire's glow. Eloan laid the cloth gently over the lantern's glass, murmuring a soft blessing as she did. The iron vines seemed to shiver beneath her touch, the light flickering faintly behind the glass. She stepped back, hands clasped before her, waiting. The square was silent, the air thick with the hush of snowfall. Eloan watched, breath held, as the cloth began to shimmer softly. At first, it was just a glimmer, a faint light threading its way through the silver stitching. But slowly, it grew brighter, illuminating the cloth from within. Symbols began to appear along its surface, winding vines and crescent moons, traced in light as delicate as frost on glass. Eloan's heart leapt, and she stepped forward, fingertips grazing the edge of the cloth. It was warm, warmer than before, and alive with energy. Her eyes flicked back to the iron lantern, its surface still and silent, yet humming with that familiar warmth. Whatever magic lay hidden within its depths was waking, stretching, yearning to be free. Eloan watched as the light danced along the linen, casting patterns of stars and vines upon the snow. She did not understand its language, not yet, but she knew its rhythm, the pulse of something ancient and powerful. And she would not abandon it. Spring began to whisper its arrival through the snow-laden streets of Starfall village. Buds of green peeked through the frost, and the river's edge softened with the first hint of thaw. Eloan continued her nightly path, lighting the lamps with her moonstone-tipped staff, her gaze always drifting back to the square where the lantern of sable flame stood waiting. Its iron vines seemed to glimmer faintly in the moonlight now, their surfaces etched with symbols that no longer hid beneath the frost. That evening, she came with purpose. Draped in a midnight blue cloak and carrying a vial of clear spring water, she knelt before the lantern and poured the water gently over its iron frame. The liquid shimmered as it touched the surface, sliding over the vines and pooling at its base. Eloan watched with wide eyes as the markings began to glow softly, threads of light weaving through the ironwork like veins of starlight. She reached out, placing her hands on the frame, feeling warmth spread through her fingertips, stronger now, pulsing like a heartbeat. A whisper curled through the air, soft and melodic, threading its way around her like the edge of a lullaby. Eloan closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of fresh rain and cedar smoke, the murmurs growing stronger with each passing moment. "I hear you," she whispered, her breath fogging the surface of the glass. "I'm listening." The lantern pulsed once beneath her hands, light flickering through the iron vines. Eloan took a deep breath and leaned closer, her eyes reflecting the glimmer of light that danced behind the glass. It was faint but steady, a glimmer that shimmered like a distant star. She pressed her palms firmly against the iron, feeling the warmth spread up her arms and into her chest. And then she heard it clearly, a voice, soft and gentle, whispering just beneath the surface of thought. It spoke not in words, but in feelings, like sunlight on water, like the whisper of wind through branches. Eloan's breath caught, her heart fluttering in her chest. "I understand," she murmured, and the lantern glowed brighter, casting soft patterns of light across the snow. The final thaw came gently to Starfall village, dripping from the eaves of cottages and swirling in rivulets along the cobblestones. But at the heart of the square, the lantern of sable flame burned with a steady light, soft and ethereal, casting long shadows that danced upon the stone. Eloan stood before it, her hands resting gently on its iron vines, feeling the warmth that thrummed beneath her fingertips. She had come to understand its whispers, not as words, but as memories, fragments of light captured and held through centuries. It had once been a beacon, a light that guided travelers through the mist-covered woods beyond the village, its glow cutting through the fog like dawn's first light. But over time, as paths changed and roads were forgotten, the lantern had dimmed, its flame shuddered away. Eloan, with her gentle hands and moonstone-tipped staff, had woken it from its slumber, coaxing forth the light that had lain dormant for so long. That evening, as the last hues of twilight faded, Eloan lit the lantern with a touch of her staff. The flame blazed to life, soft, shimmering with hues of violet and silver, casting light that stretched to the very edges of the square. Villagers stepped from their cottages, eyes wide with wonder, their faces softened by the glow. Eloan watched them from the edge of the lantern's light, her heart swelling with quiet joy. The whispers grew softer, contented, threading through her thoughts like gentle waves on a moonlit shore. Eloan smiled, her fingertips brushing the iron vines one last time. She understood now, some lights were meant to guide, even if only to remind those who wandered that the way home was never truly lost. The lantern had woken, its light a gentle promise in the heart of the village. And each night, as Eloan made her rounds, she would end her path at its side, knowing that some lights never fade, they simply wait to be found. In Starfall, Eloan tends the lanterns, but one remains dark for a century, holding secrets of forgotten magic. In the distant woodlands of Ilarion, where shadows moved like whispers and moonlight spilled over branches like droplets of silver, there lay a path known only to those who wandered without purpose. It was said the trees themselves guarded the entrance, their trunks entwined with ivy that shimmered faintly when the wind grew still. Phelan, a quiet soul with eyes like pools of rainwater, had often heard the tales whispered by firesides, spoken of in soft tones beneath flickering candlelight. They called it the Silver Canopy, a place where the trees grew taller than the steeples of old towers, their branches weaving together in a roof of leaves that glowed with an ethereal light. Phelan never believed the stories, not truly. But that evening, with the mist curling thick along the riverbanks and the scent of pine heavy in the air, something tugged at him, a whisper of curiosity he could not ignore. His feet led him past the familiar paths, away from the flickering lights of the village, and into the deeper woods where the shadows grew long and the air smelled of damp earth and cedar. He walked for hours, the light fading to twilight, his breath curling like fog before him. Just as he thought to turn back, the trees thinned, and before him stood an archway of woven branches, shimmering with dew that caught the last traces of moonlight. He stepped closer, heart fluttering like a moth's wings. The archway seemed to pulse gently, almost breathing with the rhythm of the wind. Phelan reached out, his fingers brushing the ivy that coiled around its surface. It was warm to the touch, smooth and cool, as if freshly kissed by rain. He hesitated only a moment before stepping through. The air changed at once, softer, fragrant with blossoms he could not name. Phelan paused, his breath catching in his throat. Before him stretched the silver canopy, its leaves glimmering with light, casting shadows that swayed gently as if alive. He took a breath and moved forward, the path unfurling before him like a ribbon of starlight. Phelan wandered deeper, the light of the silver canopy casting gentle hues upon his path. The ground beneath his feet was soft with moss, each step muffled as if the earth itself wished to keep his presence secret. Above him, the leaves shimmered like fragments of fallen stars, swaying ever so slightly despite the stillness of the air. He walked slowly, his fingertips grazing the trunks of trees that felt smooth as river stones, their bark traced with lines of silver. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of wildflowers and rain, though no clouds marred the sky above. Phelan paused beneath a great oak whose branches twisted and curled like the strokes of an artist's brush. Its leaves whispered softly, a sound like distant wind chimes, though no breeze stirred the air. He leaned in, pressing his ear to the bark. There it was, a hum, soft and melodic, threading its way through the silence. His heart quickened, and he stepped back, eyes wide with wonder. He continued down the winding path, his footsteps light, careful not to disturb the stillness that seemed to hold its breath. The trees grew denser, their silver leaves weaving together in intricate patterns that caught the moonlight and scattered it like flecks of frost. Phelan's mind swirled with questions, but he pressed on, driven by a whispering curiosity that tugged at the edges of his thoughts. Just as he rounded a bend, the path opened into a clearing. In its center stood a stone pedestal, worn with age, draped in soft strands of ivy. Upon it rested a single lantern, its glass fogged and rimed with silver frost. Phelan stepped closer, heart fluttering in his chest. The lantern, though dusted with age, shimmered faintly in the moonlight, its surface etched with symbols that glowed like embers. He reached out, fingertips grazing the cool surface. A whisper curled through the air, gentle and soft, stirring the leaves above. Phelan's breath stilled, something ancient and watchful had noticed his presence. Phelan stood before the lantern, fingertips brushing its surface. The glass was cool, rimed with a frost that shimmered under the moonlight. Symbols twisted along its edges, spirals, crescents, and lines that wove like delicate vines. He traced them slowly, feeling warmth bloom beneath his touch. It thrummed gently, as if responding to his presence. The clearing held its breath, silence stretching between the trees, broken only by the distant whisper of leaves. Phelan stepped back, studying the lantern. Its light was faint, a flicker just beyond sight, as though it slept beneath layers of shadow. He knelt, brushing away moss that crept along the pedestal. Beneath the green threads lay stone, etched with the same symbols that marked the glass. He brushed away more moss, revealing shapes and patterns that curled like ivy. His heart quickened. This was no ordinary place. A breeze stirred, rustling the branches above. Silver leaves shimmered, catching fragments of moonlight and scattering them across the clearing. Phelan watched as the light danced along the surface of the lantern, glimmering softly. He felt the pull of curiosity grow stronger, a whispering call that urged him to stay, to understand. But the hour was late, and the path back to the village was long. Reluctantly, he stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. He glanced once more at the lantern, its light barely visible, and then turned back toward the path. As he stepped beneath the archway of branches, he felt the whisper of ivy against his skin, warm and soft. He glanced back. The clearing was hidden again, shrouded by mist and shadow. Phelan walked back to the village, his thoughts tangled with symbols and whispers. He knew he would return. The silver canopy had not finished its story. The next evening, twilight settled over Ilarion with a softness that kissed the riverbanks and curled through the narrow streets. Phelan waited until the last lights of the village dimmed before slipping from his cottage. His footsteps were light, barely disturbing the fallen leaves as he made his way back to the woods. The archway of woven branches stood waiting, dew shimmering along the ivy like strings of pearls. Without hesitation, Phelan stepped through, the air shifting as he crossed the threshold. The canopy stretched above him, silver leaves catching moonlight and scattering it like drops of stardust. He followed the path he had walked before, his heart steady, his breath measured. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches whispering secrets he could almost hear. Phelan's fingers brushed the trunks as he passed, their bark smooth and cool, threaded with veins of silver. He moved with purpose, winding through the labyrinth of shadows until the path opened once more. There it stood, the stone pedestal, the lantern resting atop it, unchanged yet thrumming with quiet energy. Phelan stepped forward, hand reaching out to touch its surface. Warmth bloomed beneath his fingertips, stronger than the night before. He knelt before the pedestal, tracing the symbols with careful hands, feeling the steady hum that pulsed from its core. He did not know what it meant, but he knew it was waiting for something. Phelan leaned closer, whispering softly into the cool night air. "What are you hiding?" he asked, his voice barely louder than the wind. For a moment, all was still. Then, just beneath the surface of the glass, something flickered, a faint light, shimmering like the glow of a distant star. Phelan's breath caught, and the silver leaves above rustled gently, as if in reply. Phelan returned each evening, the path growing more familiar beneath his feet. The archway of branches welcomed him without question, its ivy warm beneath his touch. The lantern waited for him, resting atop its stone pedestal, symbols glimmering faintly in the moonlight. He would sit beside it, fingertips brushing the etched glass, feeling the warmth pulse softly, steady as a heartbeat. The flicker of light at its core grew stronger with each visit, shimmering like a tiny star caught behind the frost. One evening, Phelan brought with him a cloth dipped in spring water, its surface embroidered with silver threads. He knelt beside the lantern, pressing the cloth gently to its glass. Slowly, He wiped away the frost that rimed its edges, revealing the symbols in greater detail. Spirals and crescents twined together, delicate and ancient, like echoes of something long forgotten. The light pulsed beneath the glass, stronger now, casting faint patterns across his hands. As he worked, whispers drifted through the canopy, soft and distant, curling around the silver leaves like threads of mist. Phelan paused, cloth still in his hands, listening. The whispers were gentle, melodic, almost like a lullaby sung from a distant place. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wrap around him, brushing against his thoughts like drifting snow. His fingertips tingled with warmth where they touched the lantern, and for a moment, he felt something stir, a breath, a sigh, just beneath the surface. He opened his eyes, the whispers fading back into silence. The lantern shimmered before him, its light flickering steadily, casting pale shadows against the stone pedestal. Phelan's heart thudded softly in his chest. Whatever lay within the glass, it was waking. He could feel it in the hum that threaded through his fingertips, the warmth that grew stronger with each passing night. And Phelan, with his quiet heart and gentle hands, would be there to welcome it when it did. The moon hung low and heavy above the canopy, its light spilling through the leaves in delicate strands. Phelan returned once more, his lantern held steady as he stepped through the archway of branches. The air was cool and fragrant, threaded with the scent of pine and rain. Mist curled along the path, softening his footsteps, as if the forest itself wished to keep his presence hidden. When he reached the clearing, the lantern was waiting, its surface glimmering with frost. The symbols etched into its glass glowed faintly, humming with quiet energy. Phelan knelt beside it, fingertips grazing its surface. Warmth blossomed beneath his touch, and the light flickered, stronger now, more certain. His breath caught in his throat as he leaned closer, studying the shimmering patterns that wound around its base. The whispers returned, soft and insistent, curling through the leaves above. Phelan closed his eyes, listening. This time, the melody was clearer, threading through his thoughts like strands of moonlight. He could not understand the words, if they were words, but he felt the pull of them, ancient and steady. His hands pressed against the iron frame, feeling the warmth pulse beneath his palms. Suddenly, the light flared, just for a heartbeat, casting long shadows against the mossy ground. Phelan stumbled back, eyes wide with surprise. The light faded just as quickly, retreating behind the frost-glazed glass. His heart thudded in his chest, breath coming in soft clouds. Something had changed, the lantern was stirring more fiercely now, its light pressing against the glass like it longed to be free. Phelan stepped forward, his hand hovering above the iron vines. "I'm listening," he whispered, and the lantern's glow softened, as if in reply. The nights grew warmer as spring unfolded in soft whispers through the woods of Ilarion. The riverbanks thawed, and wildflowers began to peek through the frost-bitten soil, their petals brushing against the breeze like tiny splashes of color. Phelan returned to the silver canopy each evening, his footsteps light upon the moss-covered path. The archway of branches greeted him as always, its ivy warm and alive beneath his touch. He stepped into the clearing, and there stood the lantern, shimmering softly upon its stone pedestal. The symbols etched along its glass glowed faintly, tracing patterns of vines and crescent moons. Phelan approached, fingertips grazing its iron surface. The warmth that met his hand was stronger now, pulsing with a rhythm he could almost hear, a gentle hum that threaded through the silence. He knelt beside it, his breath fogging the glass as he leaned closer. For days, he had wondered what secrets lay within its iron vines. The whispers that drifted through the canopy grew clearer each night, brushing against his thoughts like threads of moonlight. He closed his eyes, his palms pressed firmly to the lantern, listening. It was not speech, not truly, but it thrummed with purpose, like the distant echo of something ancient. Phelan's heart fluttered, and he whispered softly into the stillness. "What do you want to show me?" A breeze stirred through the clearing, rustling the silver leaves above. Phelan opened his eyes just as the light flared, soft but undeniable, casting faint patterns across the moss. He drew back, eyes wide with wonder. The lantern shimmered gently, its glow stretching along the ground like the edge of dawn. Phelan's breath caught in his chest. He had seen it, truly seen it. And for the first time, he knew, something within the lantern was calling him, waiting for him to listen. The following evening, Phelan returned with a small vial of spring water, gathered from the river's edge at dawn. He carried it carefully, its surface shimmering faintly beneath the moonlight. When he stepped through the archway, the canopy above greeted him with a soft whisper, its leaves swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. The path wound before him, familiar now, traced with silvery light that danced along the moss. Phelan reached the clearing and knelt beside the lantern, its surface glimmering in the moon's glow. He unstoppered the vial, the scent of fresh water filling the air, and poured it slowly over the iron vines. The droplets shimmered as they ran along the surface, tracing the symbols with tiny rivers of light. Phelan watched, breath held, as the water pooled at the base, soaking into the moss that crept along the pedestal. The lantern pulsed beneath his hand, the light flickering stronger than before. Phelan leaned in, his fingertips grazing the iron vines. Warmth spread up his arms, soft and steady, thrumming with the rhythm of something ancient. The whispers returned, curling through the leaves above, soft and melodic. Phelan closed his eyes, listening to the hum that threaded through the silence. When he opened them, the light had softened, retreating back into the depths of the lantern. But it was clearer now, brighter than it had been before. Phelan stood slowly, his heart steady, his breath curling in the cool air. Whatever lay within the lantern was growing stronger, reaching toward him with each passing night. And Phelan, with his gentle heart, was determined to discover what lay within. Phelan returned each evening, the path beneath the silver canopy growing more familiar with every step. The archway of woven branches seemed to recognize him now, its ivy warm beneath his fingertips as he passed. The whispers drifted through the leaves as he walked, soft and melodic, threading through the air like strands of moonlight. When he reached the clearing, the lantern stood waiting, its iron vines shimmering faintly in the moon's light. This time, Phelan brought with him a small feather, pale and soft, found at the river's edge where the water ran clear and cold. He knelt before the lantern, his breath clouding the air, and tied the feather gently to one of its iron vines. As he fastened the knot, a whisper curled through the clearing, softer than the rustle of leaves. Phelan paused, his fingertips grazing the iron frame, feeling warmth pulse beneath his hand. The feather swayed gently, though no breeze stirred. Phelan watched, eyes wide, as it shimmered faintly, catching the light from the lantern. His heart fluttered, and he leaned closer, breath fogging the glass. The symbols etched along its surface seemed to glow more brightly now, tracing patterns of vines and stars that wove together in delicate loops. Phelan's fingers brushed the markings, feeling warmth spread beneath his touch. For a moment, the whispers grew stronger, threading through the silence like distant chimes. Phelan listened, heart steady, breath soft. He could not understand the words, if they were words, but he felt their rhythm, their pulse like the beat of wings. His eyes flicked back to the lantern, its light flickering gently. It was stirring, stretching toward him, its whispers curling through the stillness. Phelan stepped back, eyes bright with wonder. The lantern was waking, and he knew now that it had been waiting for him all along. Spring thickened in the woods of Ilarion, blossoms spilling from branches like pale stars caught in mid-fall. Phelan returned to the silver canopy, his heart thrumming with purpose. Each evening, the lantern grew brighter, its light shimmering with threads of silver that danced along the iron vines. The whispers grew louder too, brushing against his thoughts like drifting petals. He knew, without understanding how, that it was almost ready. That evening, Phelan came prepared. In his hands, he carried a polished mirror, its surface smooth and unblemished, framed in wrought iron that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. He knelt beside the lantern, holding the mirror up to its glass. At first, there was only his reflection, his own eyes, wide and searching. But then, as he tilted the mirror just right, light flared within the lantern, shimmering with a brightness he had not seen before. His breath caught as symbols began to glow, traced in light along the iron frame. Spirals and crescents shimmered brightly, pulsing with the rhythm of something alive. Phelan leaned closer, watching as the light curled along the glass, winding through the symbols like threads of starlight. He did not understand its language, but he felt its pulse, steady and warm beneath his fingertips. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, threading through the leaves above. Phelan closed his eyes, listening with all his heart. A breeze stirred the clearing, brushing against his face like a gentle hand. His breath stilled, his hands pressed firmly to the lantern's surface. And then, just for a moment, the whispers grew clear, a voice, soft and melodic, speaking through the leaves. Phelan's eyes opened, and the light faded back into shadow, but the echo of the voice remained, lingering in the quiet spaces of his heart. The air grew warmer as spring spread its gentle hand over the woodlands of Ilarion. Blossoms unfurled along the path to the silver canopy, their petals pale and delicate, brushing against Phelan's legs as he passed. His footsteps were light, guided by the familiar shimmer of moonlight filtering through the branches above. Each evening, the whispers grew stronger, curling through the air like threads of song, their melody winding through his thoughts. Phelan reached the clearing, his heart fluttering at the sight of the lantern. Its iron vines shimmered softly, light pulsing beneath the frost-glazed glass. He stepped closer, fingertips grazing its surface, feeling warmth bloom beneath his touch. The symbols etched along its frame glowed brighter, casting delicate patterns across the stone pedestal. Phelan knelt before it, his breath misting in the cool air. With careful hands, he untied the feather he had placed there before. It glimmered softly in his grasp, its edges still silvered with light. He held it above the lantern, whispering a gentle blessing before releasing it. The feather drifted downward, landing softly upon the iron vines. Light flared, soft but bright, threading through the symbols and illuminating the glass from within. Phelan gasped, his hand flying to his mouth as the whispers grew stronger, weaving through the canopy like wind through branches. He stepped back, eyes wide with wonder. The lantern's glow stretched out, casting soft light across the clearing. The symbols shimmered, their lines bright and clear, pulsing with energy that throbbed beneath his fingertips. Phelan knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was ready. The whispers hummed through the leaves, wrapping around him like strands of silk. Whatever had been sleeping within the lantern was stirring now, its light stretching toward the world beyond its glass. The final evening came swathed in silver mist, curling through the branches of the silver canopy like tendrils of breath. Phelan walked the path with steady steps, his heart thrumming in his chest. When he reached the clearing, the lantern was waiting, its light shimmering brightly, spilling over the moss-covered stone. He approached, fingertips brushing its iron surface, feeling warmth flood his hands. The whispers were louder now, soft and melodic, threading through the air like the first notes of a song. Phelan knelt before the lantern, hands pressed against the iron vines. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply as the whispers wove around him. The lantern pulsed beneath his touch, its light flaring brighter, casting silver patterns that danced across the ground. The canopy above shimmered, its leaves rustling softly, catching fragments of light that spilled from the glass. Phelan leaned in, his breath fogging the surface. "I am listening," he whispered, voice soft and steady. For a moment, all was still. The air hung heavy with silence, the world pausing to listen. Then, with a soft sigh, the lantern's light burst forth, bright and gentle, spilling through the clearing like dawn breaking through mist. Phelan staggered back, eyes wide, heart thudding in his chest. The light flowed outward, weaving between the trees, brushing the leaves with threads of silver. The whispers rose, melodic and clear, threading through the air with words he could not understand, but felt in his soul. As the light faded back into the lantern, the clearing grew still once more. Phelan stood in silence, breath steady, heart full. He reached out, fingertips grazing the iron vines. The lantern hummed beneath his touch, warm and alive. Phelan smiled softly, his eyes bright with wonder. He knew he would return each evening, for the whispers had found him, and he would listen, beneath the silver canopy, for as long as the light remained. In the desert of Iridia, the sands whisper at night. Lyra follows their call, uncovering echoes of ancient memories. Far beyond the edge of familiar lands, where the skies stretched wide and endless, lay the desert of Iridia. Its sands shimmered with an otherworldly light, catching the glow of the moon and scattering it like dusted silver. Few dared to wander its vast expanse, for the dunes were said to whisper at night, soft voices threading through the wind, carrying secrets long forgotten. Travelers spoke of hearing their own names called softly through the shifting sands, though none could say who or what spoke them. Lyra, a gentle soul with eyes like starlight, had always been drawn to the whispers. Her small cottage rested on the edge of the desert, its stone walls covered in vines that clung stubbornly to life. From her window, she would watch as the dunes shimmered beneath the moon, their peaks rising and falling like waves frozen in time. The whispers would drift to her on the breeze, soft, melodic, curling through the stillness of night. For years, she had listened, her heart thrumming with curiosity, though she never dared to cross the border where sand met grass. But that changed on the night of the harvest moon. The moon hung heavy and golden above the dunes, casting long shadows that flickered like embers. The whispers grew stronger, threading through her thoughts like strands of silk. Lyra stood at her window, breath held, listening. This time, the voices were clearer, softer, like sighs slipping through the cracks of old stone. Without quite knowing why, she slipped on her cloak, its edges embroidered with silver thread, and stepped out into the cool night air. The grass was damp beneath her feet, the earth soft as she made her way to the edge of the sands. The wind stirred gently, carrying with it the whispers she had always heard but never understood. Lyra paused, toes touching the edge where the grass faded into the shimmering dunes. Her heart fluttered like a sparrow's wings, and she closed her eyes. "What are you trying to say?" she whispered into the night, her voice barely louder than the wind. The whispers grew softer, curling around her like threads of moonlight, brushing against her thoughts with delicate insistence. Lyra opened her eyes, the dunes stretching before her, silver and still beneath the glow of the harvest moon. Her breath fogged the air as she stepped forward, the cool sand slipping beneath her feet. The ground was soft, almost silk-like, shifting gently with each step she took. The whispers grew louder, clearer, though still beyond the edge of understanding. Lyra walked slowly, her fingertips grazing the air as if she might catch the whispers between her hands. The dunes rose and fell around her, soft curves of silver stretching into the horizon. Her cloak fluttered behind her, catching the breeze that swept in gentle waves across the sand. She paused at the crest of a dune, the wind lifting strands of her hair, and listened. The whispers moved like a melody, soft and lilting, threading through the silence with quiet persistence. She knelt down, her fingers brushing the sand. It was warm, humming faintly beneath her touch. Lyra's heart fluttered, and she pressed her palm against the surface, feeling the vibrations pulse gently through her fingertips. "Are you alive?" she whispered, the words slipping from her lips before she could catch them. The wind stirred around her, whispering through the dunes with a sigh that almost sounded like a reply. Her eyes widened, and she pulled her hand back, studying the way the sand settled back into place. The whispers softened, fading back into the hush of the desert, but Lyra knew what she had felt, a heartbeat, soft and steady, pulsing beneath the sands. She stood slowly, her gaze drifting across the dunes that stretched like frozen waves. The whispers were waiting, calling to her from the edges of the horizon. And Lyra, with her gentle heart and restless spirit, was ready to listen. The days drifted softly after that night, sunlight spilling over the dunes of Iridia like liquid gold. Lyra returned to her cottage each morning, the whispers still lingering in her thoughts, threading through her dreams like strands of silver. She could not shake the memory of the sand's warmth, the gentle hum she had felt beneath her fingertips. It was as if the desert itself had reached out to touch her, whispering secrets just beyond her understanding. Each evening, as dusk unfurled across the sky, she would stand at the edge of the sands, listening. The wind would stir, brushing her cheeks with its cool breath, carrying with it the whispers that wove through the dunes. Lyra began to bring small offerings with her, sprigs of lavender tied with twine, petals from wildflowers that grew along the riverbank, even a silver bell that chimed softly when the breeze caught it. She would place them just beyond the edge of the grass, where the sand met the earth, and whisper soft blessings into the night. The whispers grew stronger, clearer, as if responding to her presence. One evening, as she knelt to place a feather tied with silver thread upon the sands, the wind swirled around her ankles, lifting grains of sand that shimmered with faint light. Lyra stepped back, heart thrumming with wonder. She watched as the feather trembled in the breeze, its edges glowing softly before settling back to stillness. Her breath caught in her throat, and she pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the steady beat of her heart. "You're listening," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the sigh of the wind. The dunes shimmered faintly, their peaks glimmering with a light that flickered like distant stars. Lyra smiled, her eyes bright with wonder. For the first time, she felt the connection between the whispers and herself, like threads stretching across the sands, binding her gently to the secrets of Iridia. Night fell softly over Iridia, the sky spilling with stars that glittered like shards of glass. Lyra returned to the edge of the dunes, her cloak drawn tightly around her shoulders, the wind whispering gently through the folds of her hood. She knelt upon the sand, her palms pressed flat against its surface. Warmth pulsed beneath her hands, soft and steady, as if the ground itself were breathing. She closed her eyes, listening as the whispers curled around her like tendrils of mist. This time, she understood. Not words, but feelings, impressions of longing, of waiting. It was as if the desert itself sighed beneath her touch, reaching out through the sands to brush against her thoughts. Lyra's heart quickened, and she leaned closer, her breath fogging the cool night air. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice carried off by the wind. "I'm listening." The wind stirred, lifting grains of sand that shimmered in the moonlight, swirling gently around her ankles. Lyra watched in silence, her eyes wide with wonder. The whispers grew stronger, clearer, threading through her mind with the soft persistence of a distant lullaby. She pressed her palms more firmly against the ground, feeling the warmth spread through her fingertips. It was like holding her hands to the surface of a still lake, feeling the pulse of something ancient and deep just beneath. A whisper drifted through her thoughts, soft and melodic, brushing against the edges of her understanding. Lyra's breath caught, and she leaned back, the cool air brushing her cheeks. The dunes stretched before her, silver and still beneath the light of the moon, but she knew now that they were waiting for her to listen, to understand. And Lyra, with her gentle heart, was ready to follow their call. The days melted into one another, each evening drawing Lyra back to the edge of the sands. She came with small offerings, a string of pearls found tangled in river reeds, petals from pale blossoms that grew along the garden wall, and silver threads woven into tiny braids. She would place them gently upon the dunes, watching as the wind curled around them, carrying whispers that brushed against her ears like drifting snow. One evening, as the moon hung low and full above the horizon, she brought with her a lantern, its glass fogged with age and its handle wrapped in fraying twine. Lyra placed it carefully at the edge of the sand, lighting the wick with a breath of tinder. Soft light spilled across the dunes, casting long shadows that swayed gently with the breeze. The whispers grew louder, threading through the night with a clarity she had never heard before. Lyra knelt beside the lantern, her hands pressed to the sand, feeling warmth bloom beneath her palms. The ground thrummed softly, a gentle hum that pulsed with the rhythm of something alive. She leaned closer, eyes half closed, listening. The whispers moved like a melody, soft and steady, threading through her thoughts. She could almost make out words, fragments of something ancient and melodic. Her breath stilled, and she pressed her fingertips deeper into the sand, feeling the hum spread through her hands and up her arms. It was stronger now, more certain, like the echo of a heartbeat. Lyra's eyes fluttered open, the light from her lantern casting faint patterns across the dunes. "I'm listening," she whispered, voice soft and steady. The whispers curled around her, brushing against her cheeks like the edge of a sigh. For the first time, Lyra felt she was truly being heard. The following night, Lyra returned with a small mirror, its surface polished and framed in tarnished silver. She held it close as she stepped through the twilight haze, her breath clouding the cool evening air. The lantern she had left glimmered faintly at the edge of the dunes, its flame still steady, casting pale light across the sand. Lyra knelt beside it, the mirror cradled in her hands, and watched the moonlight ripple across its surface. Her heart thrummed softly as she held the mirror up to the dunes. At first, she saw only the stretch of silver sand, smooth and unbroken beneath the glow of the lantern. But as she tilted the mirror, the surface shimmered, revealing shapes that flickered just beyond sight. Lyra leaned closer, breath held, as shadows stretched and curled within the reflection. Silhouettes of branches swayed, leaves drifting upon a breeze she could not feel. The whispers grew louder, brushing through her mind like the edge of a melody, soft and lingering. Lyra closed her eyes, feeling the rhythm of it thrumming beneath her fingertips. She did not understand the language, if it was language, but she felt its purpose, the pull of something ancient and patient. Her fingers grazed the sand, feeling its warmth pulse beneath her touch. "Show me," she whispered, her voice carried off by the wind. A sigh threaded through the air, soft and melodic. The mirror trembled in her hands, its surface fogging with breath that was not her own. Lyra's eyes opened, and she stared at the reflection. The dunes shimmered softly, the shapes more visible now, branches winding like rivers, leaves dancing on invisible winds. For the first time, she felt the edge of understanding brush against her thoughts. The whispers were not just calling, they were showing her the way. The nights grew longer, the moon spilling silver light across the sands of Iridia. Lyra's visits became a ritual. Each evening, she would step out from her cottage, her cloak trailing softly over the grass, and make her way to the edge of the dunes. The lantern flickered where she had left it, casting long, delicate shadows that danced upon the surface of the sand. She would kneel beside it, hands pressed to the ground, listening to the whispers thread through the stillness. One evening, she brought with her a length of silk, pale as starlight and soft to the touch. She draped it over the lantern's iron frame, its edges catching the moonlight and shimmering faintly. The whispers grew stronger, curling through the air with gentle insistence. Lyra knelt beside the lantern, her fingertips grazing the sand. The warmth pulsed beneath her touch, steady and sure, spreading through her hands like threads of light. The silk fluttered in the wind, though the air was still. Lyra watched with wide eyes as the fabric shimmered, light tracing its patterns like veins of silver. The whispers grew clearer, more insistent, threading through her mind in soft waves. Lyra leaned forward, her breath fogging the air. "I'm ready," she whispered, voice soft and steady. "Show me." For a moment, everything grew still. The wind paused, the whispers softened, and the dunes seemed to hold their breath. Then, slowly, the sand shifted beneath her hands, grains trembling like the surface of water. Lyra gasped, pulling her hands back as the sand began to swirl, forming delicate spirals that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. The whispers grew louder, threading through the silence with a melody that curled around her heart. Lyra watched, breathless, as the dunes began to move, revealing paths she had never seen before. Lyra stared in wonder as the sand parted before her, spiraling outward in delicate, swirling patterns. The whispers grew clearer, weaving through the stillness like threads of melody. She stepped forward, her feet sinking softly into the warm sand, and followed the path that unfurled before her. The lantern's glow stretched along the ground, illuminating the way as if it had always been waiting for her to see. The dunes rose and fell around her, their peaks shimmering faintly under the moon's gaze. Lyra moved carefully, her hands brushing the air as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. The sand hummed beneath her feet, warm and pulsing with the rhythm of the whispers. She paused at the crest of a dune, her breath fogging the cool night air, and gazed out over the vastness of Iridia. The path stretched onward, winding between the silver dunes like a ribbon of light. Lyra knelt, her fingertips brushing the surface of the sand. It thrummed beneath her touch, vibrating gently, as if alive with unspoken secrets. "You're calling me somewhere," she whispered, her voice carried off by the wind. The sand shimmered faintly, and the whispers grew louder, threading through her thoughts with quiet insistence. Lyra stood slowly, her cloak fluttering in the soft breeze, and took her first steps along the path. The way before her curved gently, the sand parting with each step she took. Lyra moved with purpose, her heart thrumming with quiet excitement. The whispers wove around her, soft and melodic, brushing against her thoughts like the edge of a lullaby. She knew now that she was being guided, somewhere hidden deep within the heart of the dunes. And Lyra, with her gentle spirit, was ready to follow wherever the whispers led. The path stretched before Lyra, winding through the dunes like a ribbon of silver light. Each step she took felt soft and steady, the sand humming faintly beneath her feet. The whispers curled around her, brushing against her thoughts with delicate insistence. She walked slowly, fingertips grazing the air as if she might catch the whispers between her hands. The wind stirred gently, carrying the scent of distant rain and something sweeter, like blossoms after a storm. The moon hung heavy above the desert, casting long shadows that swayed across the dunes. Lyra paused at the crest of a hill, her breath curling in the cool night air. Below her stretched an expanse of shimmering sand, broken only by the faint outline of something nestled between the dunes. Her heart quickened, and she stepped forward, the sand shifting beneath her feet as she descended. The whispers grew louder, threading through the silence with a melody that hummed just beneath the surface of understanding. As she drew closer, the outline grew clearer, a circle of stones, half buried in sand and dusted with faint light. Lyra knelt beside them, brushing away the grains that clung to their surfaces. Symbols were etched into the stone, spirals and crescents that mirrored those she had seen in her dreams. Her fingertips grazed the carvings, feeling warmth spread beneath her touch. The whispers pulsed softly, curling around her thoughts like threads of moonlight. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as the stones began to shimmer, light threading through the symbols and casting delicate patterns across the sand. The whispers grew clearer, almost like voices just beyond her reach. She leaned in, pressing her palms flat against the stone, eyes half closed as she listened. A warmth thrummed through her hands, steady and strong, pulsing with the rhythm of something ancient and patient. Lyra's eyes fluttered open, her heart beating steadily. Whatever lay beneath the sands of Iridia was waiting for her to listen, and now, she was ready. Lyra returned the next evening, her heart thrumming with quiet anticipation. The lantern she had left flickered softly at the edge of the dunes, its flame casting delicate shadows that swayed in the breeze. She stepped carefully along the path that had unfolded the night before, her footsteps light upon the sand. The whispers grew stronger with each step she took, brushing against her thoughts like strands of silver. When she reached the circle of stones, Lyra knelt beside them, her fingertips grazing their cool surfaces. The symbols etched along the stone shimmered faintly in the moonlight, catching the light and scattering it across the sand. Lyra took a breath, steadying herself, and placed her palms firmly against the carvings. The warmth bloomed beneath her hands, pulsing with a steady rhythm that thrummed through her fingertips. The whispers stirred, threading through the silence with gentle insistence. Lyra closed her eyes, listening as they wove around her, soft and melodic. It was not quite language, not words she could understand, but it thrummed with purpose, humming with the weight of something old and unspoken. Her breath stilled, and she pressed her hands more firmly to the stone, feeling the hum spread through her palms and into her chest. Then, slowly, the symbols began to glow. Light traced their edges, spiraling outward in soft waves that shimmered across the sand. Lyra's eyes opened wide, breath catching in her throat. The whispers grew louder, more certain, curling around her like threads of moonlight. She leaned forward, her hands pressed firmly against the stone, listening to the hum that pulsed beneath her fingertips. The path had led her here, not by accident, but by design. Lyra's heart fluttered softly, and she knew that something ancient was waking beneath the sands of Iridia. The moon hung low over the dunes of Iridia, casting long shadows that shimmered like waves upon the sand. Lyra returned each evening, her steps light and sure as she followed the winding path to the circle of stones. The whispers grew stronger with each visit, curling through the air with a melody she could almost understand. She brought small offerings, silver threads, petals from wildflowers, and sprigs of lavender tied with twine, and laid them gently upon the stones. That evening, the wind stirred softly as she knelt before the circle, her fingertips grazing the carved symbols that spiraled along the stone's surface. Warmth pulsed beneath her touch, steady and gentle, thrumming with the rhythm of something ancient. The symbols shimmered faintly in the moonlight, catching the light and casting it back in delicate patterns. Lyra took a breath, steady and slow, and placed her hands firmly against the carvings. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the silence with purpose. Lyra closed her eyes, letting the sound thread through her thoughts. The warmth beneath her hands spread, pulsing gently, and the sand around the stones began to shimmer. Her breath caught in her throat as the symbols glowed brighter, light spilling across the ground like threads of silver. Lyra leaned closer, her heart fluttering with quiet wonder. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice carried off by the wind. The ground beneath her hands trembled softly, and the sand began to shift, swirling outward in delicate spirals. Light flared between the stones, rising up in soft waves that shimmered with hues of violet and silver. Lyra watched, breathless, as the light danced along the surface of the sand, threading through the symbols like veins of starlight. The whispers grew clearer, melodic and soft, winding through the night with the grace of a lullaby. Lyra knew, with a certainty that settled deep within her, that whatever was waiting beneath the sands of Iridia was finally waking. The dunes of Iridia shimmered beneath the light of the full moon, their surfaces rippling like water caught in the wind. Lyra stood before the circle of stones, her breath misting in the cool night air. The whispers wove around her, soft and melodic, curling through the silence like the edge of a song. The symbols along the stone's surface glowed with a soft light, casting shadows that danced across the sand. Lyra knelt, her hands pressed to the stone, feeling the warmth pulse beneath her fingertips. The whispers grew louder, threading through her thoughts with gentle insistence. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and listened. The ground thrummed softly beneath her hands, the light flickering with the rhythm of something alive. The sand shimmered, curling outward in delicate spirals that caught the moonlight and scattered it like stars. The air grew still, the whispers softening to a gentle hum. Lyra opened her eyes, watching as the light flared one last time, casting its glow across the dunes. The spirals shimmered, tracing paths that wove through the sands like threads of silver. For a heartbeat, the entire desert seemed to breathe, its surface shifting with a sigh that brushed against her thoughts. Lyra stood slowly, her hands slipping from the stone, her breath steady and calm. The light faded back into the symbols, the whispers settling into a gentle hush. Lyra stepped back, her heart thrumming with quiet wonder. The dunes of Iridia shimmered softly beneath the moonlight, their surfaces rippling with echoes of what had just passed. Lyra knew, with a certainty that settled deep within her, that she had listened to the whispers, and they had listened back. With a final glance at the silver-lit sands, she turned and walked back to her cottage, knowing she would always hear the whispers, no matter where she wandered.